The night was thick with silence, the kind of silence that pressed down on you, making your skin crawl. Sarah sat in her small, dimly lit apartment, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the refrigerator. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second a reminder of her solitude. She had always liked being alone. It gave her time to think, to breathe, to escape the chaos of the world outside. But tonight felt different. Tonight the shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the darkness felt alive. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the window panes. Sarah wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling them close to her chest. She glanced at the window, half expecting to see a figure staring back at her, but there was nothing, just the swirling darkness beyond the glass. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into her mind. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The stories she had read, the movies she had watched, they were all playing tricks on her. But as the wind howled louder, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that didn't want to be seen. She stood up, heart racing, and walked to the window. Peering out into the night, she squinted, trying to make out shapes in the shadows. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the pavement. She saw nothing unusual, just the empty street, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Returning to her couch, Sarah picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, searching for someone to call. But who would she call? Most of her friends were busy with their lives, and she didn't want to bother them with her silly fears. Peering out into the night, she squinted, trying to make out shapes in the shadows. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the pavement. She saw nothing unusual, just the empty street, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Suddenly a loud bang echoed from the kitchen. Sarah jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced toward the kitchen, the dark doorway looming like a gaping mouth. Just the wind, she whispered to herself, but doubt gnawed at her. Instead, she opened a horror app on her phone, hoping to distract herself with some chilling tales. As she read, the stories of haunted houses and restless spirits filled her mind, feeding her anxiety. She set her phone down and took a deep breath, forcing her feet to move. She needed to check it out. As she walked into the kitchen, she flicked on the light. The bright bulb flickered for a moment before casting a warm glow over the small space. She was sure she had locked it earlier. A chill ran down her spine. Hello, she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Just the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She walked to the door and pulled it shut, locking it tightly. It's just the wind, she repeated, trying to convince herself. Back on the couch, she wrapped herself in a blanket, her heart still racing. She turned on the television, hoping the noise would drown out her thoughts. The flickering screen brought a sense of comfort, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker. She glanced at the clock again. It was almost midnight. The witching hour. The show she was watching faded into the background as her mind wandered. She thought about the stories she had read, the things that went bump in the night. What if they were real? What if something was hiding in the shadows, waiting for her to let her guard down? She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She was being ridiculous. But then a soft scratching sound broke through her thoughts. It came from the window. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. She turned slowly, her heart racing. The curtains swayed slightly, as if something was trying to get in. "What is it?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. Gathering her courage, she stood up and walked to the window. With trembling hands, she pulled back the curtain. Outside, the darkness stretched endlessly, but there was nothing there, just the wind rustling through the trees. She let out a shaky breath, feeling foolish. It was just the branches, she told herself. But as she turned to walk away, she heard it again, a soft, deliberate scratching. This time it was coming from the back door. Panic surged through her. She rushed to the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing, just darkness. "Is someone there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence answered her. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. She had to call someone. She grabbed her phone, but the screen was dark. The battery was dead. No, she muttered, feeling the walls closing around her. She glanced at the clock again. It was past midnight now. She needed to think. She grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, the cold metal grounding her in reality. If someone was out there, she would be ready. She moved cautiously toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The scratching continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm that sent shivers down her spine. Taking a deep breath, she flung open the door, brandishing the knife. But there was nothing. Just the empty porch, the night air thick with tension. "What the hell?" she whispered, stepping outside. The wind whipped around her, and she felt exposed, vulnerable. She scanned the yard, searching for any sign of movement. Then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, just outside the reach of the streetlight. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by shadows. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice stronger than she felt. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching her. She felt a wave of fear wash over her, a primal instinct to run. But her feet were rooted to the ground. "Get away from my house," she yelled, trying to sound braver than she felt. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Sarah felt a rush of adrenaline. She had to know what it was. She stepped off the porch and moved toward the trees, gripping the knife tightly. The darkness enveloped her as she stepped into the yard. The wind rustled the leaves, creating a haunting melody that echoed in her ears. She could see the outline of the trees ahead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. Was she really going to chase after it? But curiosity won over fear. She pushed forward, the grass crunching beneath her feet. The further she went, the more the shadows seemed to close in around her. She called out again, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Her voice trembled, and the only response was the whisper of the wind. As she reached the edge of the trees, she stopped, straining to see into the darkness. The figure was gone, but something felt off. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. She felt a chill run down her spine. I should go back, she thought, but the urge to know what was out there pulled her deeper into the woods. Suddenly, a loud snap echoed behind her. She spun around, heart racing. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. But there was only silence. The shadows shifted, and she felt a presence lurking just beyond her sight. The scratching returned, but this time it was closer, more frantic. It felt like it was coming from all around her. Panic surged through her. She turned to run, but the darkness seemed to thicken, wrapping around her like a shroud. She stumbled, falling to the ground, the knife slipping from her grasp. Thought, "Get up, get up," she urged herself, scrambling to her feet. The scratching was relentless now, echoing in her ears. She could feel something watching her, something hungry. She turned and ran, branches clawing at her arms as she pushed through the underbrush. The trees seemed to close in around her, and the darkness swallowed her whole. She could feel something watching her, something hungry. She turned and ran, branches clawing at her arms as she pushed through the underbrush. The trees seemed to close in around her, and the darkness swallowed her whole. She could hear whispers now, low and sinister, weaving through the air. "Sarah," they called, her name echoing like a haunting melody. She ran faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, she burst into a clearing, the moonlight spilling down like a silver veil. She looked around, desperate for a way out. But the trees surrounded her, a wall of darkness closing in. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. "Sarah, come play with us. She turned, searching for the source of the voice. It was then that she saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their faces pale and hollow. They were children, their eyes wide and empty, gazing at her with an unsettling hunger. "Join us," they said in unison, their voices a chilling chorus. "No," she screamed, backing away. But there was nowhere to go. They stepped closer, their movements fluid and unnatural. The scratching sound intensified, echoing in her mind. She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. "Please leave me alone," she cried, but they only smiled, their mouths stretching impossibly wide. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if it was shifting, pulling her down. She stumbled, falling to her knees. "Help us," one of the children whispered, reaching out a bony hand. "We're trapped here, just like you." In that moment, Sarah understood they were lost souls caught in the darkness, just like her. She felt a wave of pity wash over her, but fear quickly followed. "I can't help you," she shouted, scrambling to her feet. The children's smiles faded, replaced by expressions of sorrow. "You will join us," they said, their voices echoing like a distant thunder. The ground trembled and the shadows surged forward, enveloping her. Sarah turned to run, but the darkness was too strong. It wrapped around her, pulling her down into the earth. She screamed, the sounds followed by the void. The last thing she saw was the pale faces of the children, their eyes filled with a haunting longing. And then silence. When the sun rose the next morning, the world was bright and normal. The birds chirped and the wind whispered through the trees. Sarah's apartment stood empty, the door still locked tight. But if you looked look closely, you might see a shadow flitting past the window, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. Alone at night, the scratching would begin again and the whispers would call out, forever searching for someone to join them in the darkness.